Hello, dear ones. Thank you for being here today. I want to share something with you. Not a story from my own life this time, but something I felt needed to be told. A story about truth, about power, and about the importance of listening. Please stay with me. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to spend hours reading court documents. But there I was, sitting at my kitchen table, reading page after page of legal filings. My reading glasses kept sliding down my nose, my tea had gone cold, and my heart felt heavier with every word. You see, I'd heard the name Jeffrey Epstein mentioned so many times, in the news, online, in conversations with friends. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Everyone seemed to know something. But when I started asking questions, really asking, I realized how much of what we hear is rumor, how much is speculation, how much gets twisted as it passes from person to person. And I thought to myself, someone needs to just tell what actually happened, what the court said, what the investigators found, what the victims bravely came forward to share. So I decided to do something I'd never done before. I requested the public records. I read the official documents. I went through the verified timeline piece by piece. Not because I wanted to be entertained by scandal, not because I enjoy darkness, but because I believe the truth matters. And I believe the people who suffered deserve to have their experiences honored with accuracy, not sensationalism. What I found was not what I expected. It wasn't a simple story. It wasn't black and white. It was a deeply troubling account of how systems failed, how money and power created shields, how young people were hurt while the world looked away. This is not an easy story to tell, but it's an important one. So I'm going to share with you what I learned, calmly, truthfully, and with the respect this subject deserves. If this story touches you, please consider subscribing. This is the kind of truth-telling we need more of. Let me start at the beginning, or at least where the public record begins. Jeffrey Epstein was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1953. He came from a middle-class family. His father worked for the city's parks department. Nothing about his early life suggested what would come later. He was smart, good at mathematics. He went to college, but didn't finish. That's all documented. In the 1970s, he began teaching math and physics at a private school in Manhattan, even without a degree. That's where he met people with money, people with connections, and somehow he made the leap from being a teacher to working in finance. By the early 1980s, he'd started his own firm, managing money for wealthy clients. The details of how he built his fortune are murky. Even financial investigators struggled to understand exactly what he did. But what's clear is that by the 1990s, Jeffrey Epstein was very, very rich. He owned a mansion in New York, a private island in the Caribbean, properties in Florida, New Mexico, and Paris. He flew on private jets. He moved in circles with presidents, princes, scientists, and celebrities. People were drawn to him, or maybe they were drawn to his money and his access. He presented himself as a philanthropist. He donated to universities. He funded scientific research. He threw parties where the most powerful people in the world gathered. On the surface, it looked like success, like the American dream. But underneath, something else was happening, something that would take years to fully uncover. The first official legal trouble came in 2005. That's when the Palm Beach Police Department in Florida received a report from a woman. She said her 14-year-old stepdaughter had been paid to give a massage to an older man. The girl told her stepmother what had happened, and the stepmother went to the police. That report started an investigation. Detectives interviewed the girl. Then they started finding others. More girls, more stories. Young women, many of them from troubled backgrounds, many of them struggling financially. They described being recruited, being promised money for massages, being taken to Epstein's Palm Beach mansion. And then they described what actually happened there. The police built a case. They gathered evidence. They interviewed dozens of potential victims. The lead detective on the case later said they'd identified about 35 girls who'd had contact with Epstein. Some were as young as 14. The detectives believed they had enough evidence for serious charges. But this is where the story starts to show how systems can fail. Epstein hired some of the most expensive lawyers in the country, men who'd defended presidents and billionaires. They fought the case hard. They questioned the credibility of the young women. They used every legal tool they had. And in 2008, something happened that would anger people for years to come. Instead of facing federal charges that could have meant life in prison, Epstein signed a plea deal. The agreement was handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami. The prosecutor was a man named Alexander Acosta. Under that deal, Epstein pled guilty to 2 state charges in Florida, soliciting prostitution from a minor. He was sentenced to 18 months in county jail. But even that wasn't what it seemed. He was allowed to leave jail during the day for work. He spent most of his time in his office. He only slept in jail. And here's the part that still makes my chest tight when I think about it. The victims weren't told about the plea deal. They weren't given a chance to speak. The agreement was made quietly, behind closed doors. Epstein served 13 months. Then he was released. He registered as a sex offender, but he went back to his mansions, his money, his life. For over a decade, it seemed like the story was over, like he'd gotten away with it, like justice had been bought and sold. But the women who'd hurt didn't forget, and some people kept digging. If you're still with me, thank you. I know this isn't easy to hear, but please stay. The truth matters. Over the years, journalists kept asking questions. Lawyers representing some of the victims kept fighting. They argued that the 2008 plea deal had violated federal law, specifically the Crime Victims' Rights Act, which says victims must be informed and allowed to participate in legal proceedings. In 2018, a federal judge agreed. She ruled that the prosecutors had indeed broken the law by not telling Epstein's victims about the plea agreement. But by then, the deal was done. Epstein had already served his time. There was no going back. Still, the ruling mattered. It brought the case back into the public eye. It reminded people that something had gone very wrong. And then, in 2019, investigative reporters published new stories. They'd found more women, more accounts, more evidence that Epstein's behavior hadn't stopped after his conviction. The reports described a network, a system of recruiters who found young women, often vulnerable ones, and brought them to Epstein's properties. One woman, Virginia Giuffre, had been speaking publicly for years. She'd filed legal papers describing her experiences. She said she'd been recruited as a teenager while working at Mar-a-Lago, a resort in Florida. She said she'd been trafficked to Epstein's properties around the world. She named other powerful men she said had abused her. Other women came forward too, each one brave, each one risking being doubted, being questioned, being hurt all over again. The reports were detailed, they were disturbing, and they made federal prosecutors take another look. In July 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested again. This time, it was federal charges, serious ones. The indictment accused him of sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. The charges covered conduct from 2002 to 2005, but prosecutors made it clear they believed the behavior had continued much longer. He was taken into custody at an airport in New Jersey. He'd just flown in from Paris on his private jet. He was brought to New York, and this time the prosecutors were not offering deals. The lead prosecutor stood in front of cameras and said that Epstein had sexually exploited and abused dozens of minor girls. She said the victims deserved justice. She said the case would move forward. For the first time in years, it felt like accountability might actually happen. Epstein was held without bail. The judge said he was a danger to the community and a flight risk. He had the resources to disappear. He had properties all over the world. He wasn't going anywhere except a jail cell. The case moved forward. Documents were unsealed. Names were mentioned. People who'd been connected to Epstein, some famous, some powerful, were suddenly under scrutiny. The public wanted answers. Who knew what? Who participated? Who looked away? And then, on August 10th, 2019, something happened that changed everything. Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. The official cause of death was suicide by hanging. He'd been on suicide watch earlier, but had been taken off it. There were supposed to be guards checking on him every 30 minutes, but the guards had fallen asleep. The cameras that should have been recording the area weren't working. The news hit like a shockwave. People were angry, they were confused, they felt cheated. How could this happen? How could someone so high profile in such a high security facility die in his cell? How could the one person who knew everything, who could name names, who could reveal the full truth, be gone? Conspiracy theories exploded. People didn't believe it was suicide. They thought he'd been silenced. They thought powerful people had orchestrated it to protect themselves. I'm not going to speculate. I'm only going to tell you what the official investigations found. The FBI investigated. The Department of Justice's Inspector General investigated. The New York City medical examiner performed an autopsy. All of them concluded that Epstein had died by suicide. The autopsy found injuries consistent with hanging. The investigators found serious failures in the prison's procedures. Guards falsifying records, supervisors not doing their jobs, a culture of negligence. 2 guards were charged with falsifying records. They later entered into a deferred prosecution agreement, which means the charges would be dismissed if they met certain conditions. But none of that brought Epstein back to stand trial. None of that gave the victims their day in court. The criminal case against him was closed because you can't prosecute a dead man. The women who'd waited years for justice were left with nothing. No trial, no testimony, no chance to face him and say what he'd done. One of the prosecutors said it best. She stood in front of those women and said, "I'm sorry. We're sorry." And I sat at my kitchen table reading those words, and I cried. Tell me in the comments, how do we prevent something like this from happening again? Even though Jeffrey Epstein was gone, the story wasn't over. Because there were still people who'd helped him, people who'd enabled him, people who'd looked the other way or actively participated. One of those people was a woman named Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine was born in France, the daughter of a British media mogul. She was educated, wealthy, well-connected. She moved in elite circles. And, according to prosecutors and victims, she was Epstein's right hand. The indictment against Ghislaine Maxwell was unsealed in July 2020. It accused her of helping Epstein recruit, groom, and abuse young girls. It said she'd gained their trust, she'd made them feel safe, and then she'd delivered them to Epstein. Some of the charges went back to the 90s. The indictment described how she'd befriend girls, often teenagers from difficult situations. She'd take them shopping. She'd talk to them about their lives. She'd make them feel special. And then, slowly, she'd introduce them to Epstein. The charges were specific: enticement of a minor to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, transportation of a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, conspiracy, perjury because she'd lied under oath in a previous civil case. Ghislaine was arrested at a property in New Hampshire in July 2020. She'd been hiding, living under a different name. She was brought to New York and held without bail. And this time, the system didn't fail. The guards stayed awake, the cameras worked, she was watched. Her trial began in November 2021. It lasted about a month. And during that trial, the public finally heard, in detail, what had happened to these young women. 4 women testified. They were adults now, but they'd been teenagers when they met Ghislaine and Epstein. One by one, they took the stand. They used pseudonyms to protect their privacy: Jane, Kate, Carolyn, Annie. They described how they'd been recruited, how Ghislaine had been friendly and warm at first, how she'd made them feel comfortable, and then how things had changed. I won't describe the abuse in detail. That's not what this is about. But I will say this. These women were brave. Unbelievably brave. They sat in a courtroom in front of strangers, in front of cameras, And they told the truth. They faced cross-examination, they faced doubt, they faced having the hardest moments of their lives questioned and picked apart. And they did it anyway. One woman, testifying as Jane, said she'd been 14 when she first met Epstein and Maxwell. She said Ghislaine had made her feel seen and cared for. And then she said Ghislaine had participated in the abuse, had touched her, had made it seem normal. Another woman, Carolyn, said she'd been 14 and struggling with poverty and family problems. She said a friend had brought her to Epstein's house. She said Ghislaine had scheduled her appointments, had told her what to do, had paid her in cash. The defense tried to argue that the women's memories were unreliable, that they were motivated by money because some had filed civil suits, that they'd been influenced by lawyers or media coverage. The defense painted Ghislaine as a scapegoat, someone being blamed because Epstein was dead and people wanted someone to punish. But the jury didn't buy it. On December 29, 2021, after 5 days of deliberation, they came back with a verdict. Guilty on 5 of the 6 counts. Guilty of conspiracy to entice a minor to travel to engage in illegal sex acts. Guilty of conspiracy to transport a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity. Guilty of transportation of a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity. Guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking conspiracy and sex trafficking of a minor. When the verdict was read, some of the victims in the courtroom cried. Some hugged each other. Some just sat quietly, letting it sink in. Ghislaine Maxwell showed no emotion. She stood there, still and silent. In June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The judge called her crimes heinous and predatory. She said Ghislaine had caused incalculable harm to vulnerable young women. Before sentencing, some of the victims spoke. They addressed the court. They addressed Ghislaine. One woman said, "You broke me in ways I cannot even describe." Another said, "Ghislaine, you deserve to spend the rest of your life in prison." And Ghislaine, for the first time, addressed the court. She said she was sorry for the pain the victims had experienced, but she didn't admit to the crimes. She said she hoped her sentence would bring them peace. It felt, to many, like too little too late. The Maxwell trial was the closest thing to justice many of these women would ever get. It wasn't perfect, it didn't undo what had happened to them, but it was something. It was the system finally saying, "We believe you, we see you. What happened to you was wrong." After the criminal cases were finished, there were still the civil cases, the lawsuits brought by women seeking financial compensation for what had been done to them. These cases moved more quietly, but they mattered. Epstein's estate was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Even after his death, that money existed, and the women who'd been hurt argued they deserved some of it. A victim compensation fund was established. It was managed independently, not by the estate. Women could come forward, tell their stories to administrators, and if their claims were verified, they'd receive compensation. The amounts were confidential, but reports said the fund paid out more than $120 million to over 150 women. This process wasn't perfect either. Some women felt the amounts weren't enough. Some felt the process re-traumatized them, making them relive everything in order to prove what had happened. Some decided not to participate at all. But for others, it was a form of acknowledgement. It was someone finally saying, what you went through was real, and you deserve something in return. There were also lawsuits against institutions, against banks that had done business with Epstein even after his 2008 conviction, against individuals who'd allegedly helped him or enabled him. One of the most high-profile civil cases involved Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, a member of the British royal family. Virginia Giuffre filed a lawsuit against him, saying he'd sexually abused her when she was 17, after she'd been trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell. Prince Andrew denied the allegations. He gave a television interview where he said he couldn't remember meeting her, even though there was a photograph of them together. The interview was widely criticized. People didn't find him credible. In February 2022, Prince Andrew settled the lawsuit. He didn't admit to any wrongdoing, but he paid an undisclosed sum to Virginia Giuffre and made a donation to her charity supporting victims' rights. In the settlement, he acknowledged that she suffered as a victim of abuse, and he regretted his association with Epstein. It wasn't a court victory, but it was, again, a kind of acknowledgement. Throughout all of this, people kept asking the bigger questions. How did this happen? How did Epstein operate for so long? Who else was involved? Investigative journalists kept digging. They found more details about his connections. They found flight logs showing who traveled on his private jet, though being on a flight didn't mean someone had done anything wrong. They found visitor logs from his properties. They found financial records showing payments and investments. Some names that came up were people in business, in science, in politics, in entertainment. Some had been photographed with him at events. Some had taken donations from him. Some had visited his properties. But here's what's important to understand. Being connected to Epstein didn't automatically mean someone knew or participated in his crimes. Rich and powerful people move in the same circles. They attend the same events. They know each other. That's how those worlds work. The investigations focused on finding evidence of actual wrongdoing, and for most of the people whose names came up, there wasn't evidence that they broke the law. That didn't stop the speculation, it didn't stop the rumors, but in terms of official findings, criminal charges were only brought against Epstein and Maxwell. There were also investigations into how the system had failed, why the 2008 plea deal had happened, why Epstein had been allowed such lenient treatment. The Department of Justice's Investigator General conducted a review. The report, released in 2020, was scathing. It found that the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami had used poor judgment, that they'd been overly deferential to Epstein's lawyers, that they'd failed to communicate with victims and had violated their rights. But the report also found that the decisions, while wrong, didn't rise to the level of professional misconduct. No one was disbarred, no one faced criminal charges. Alexander Acosta, the prosecutor who'd approved the plea deal, had gone on to become Secretary of Labor under President Trump. After the Epstein case came back in the news in 2019, Acosta resigned. He said he didn't want his past decisions to distract from his work. And the prison system, the failures that had allowed Epstein to die? The Investigator General's report on that was released in 2020 as well. It found a culture of neglect at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Guards sleeping on duty, supervisors not supervising, cameras not working, policies not followed. The two guards who were supposed to be watching Epstein's cell were charged with falsifying records. As I mentioned, they entered into a deferred prosecution agreement. The facility itself was later closed, though that was part of a broader plan to replace aging federal detention centers in New York. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a complicated picture. Justice was done in some ways. Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison. Victims received some compensation. The truth came out, at least partially. But it also leaves us with questions. How many other girls were hurt? Why didn't more people face consequences? How do we make sure something like this never happens again? I don't have all the answers. I'm just someone who read the records and wanted to share what I found. But I do know this. The women who came forward are heroes. They faced systems that doubted them. They faced lawyers who attacked them. They faced a world that often doesn't believe survivors. And they told the truth anyway. When I finally finished reading through all the documents, I sat back in my chair and took a long breath. My tea was cold. The light outside had changed. Hours had passed. And I felt a mixture of things. Sadness for the women who'd suffered, anger at the systems that had failed them, frustration that so much had been allowed to happen in the shadows, but also hope that their courage had changed something. Since the Epstein case became public again, there have been changes. The Crime Victims' Rights Act is taken more seriously. Prosecutors are more careful about plea deals in cases involving exploitation of minors. There's more awareness about how wealth and power can create shields that protect predators. It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's something. I learned another thing. I learned how important it is to separate fact from rumor, to look for verified information instead of just believing what we hear. Because when we spread speculation, when we turn real pain into entertainment, we dishonor the people who suffered. The women at the center of this case aren't characters in a story. They're real people. They were real girls when this happened to them. They have names and lives and families, and they deserve our respect. If you take one thing from what I've shared today, let it be this. Believe survivors. Listen to them. Don't make them prove themselves over and over. Don't question their motives or their memories or their worth. And if you're someone in a position of power, a teacher, a coach, a boss, a parent, anyone, use that power to protect the vulnerable, not to harm them. Speak up when you see something wrong. Don't look the other way. Don't stay silent because it's uncomfortable or because it might cost you something. If this story touched you, please leave a comment. Share your thoughts. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Not for the drama, not for the scandal, but for the truth. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care of one another. And remember, your voice matters. Use it for good. Thank you for listening with an open heart. Until next time, take care of one another. And remember, truth and kindness can change the world.